The morning Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Eugene Briggs found his dog lying in the grass, still barely breathing, her amber eyes tracking nothing. He did not yell, he did not run next door. He knelt in the wet earth in his pajama pants, picked her up like she was made of glass, and drove 40 miles to the emergency veterinary clinic in silence. By the time he carried her through those clinic doors, his hands were shaking. Not from panic. From the kind of cold, controlled fury that only men who have seen real war ever learn to carry. Her name was Ginger, she was 11 years old, and someone had poisoned her. Let me tell you about Willowbrook Estates. It's a quiet, unassuming neighborhood tucked into the northwest corner of Clarksville, Tennessee, about 3 miles from the main gate of Fort Campbell. The summer of 2019, it was the kind of place where the kids still rode bikes until dark, where sprinklers ran at 6 in the morning, and where the smell of cut grass and charcoal drifted through the air on Saturday afternoons like something out of a magazine ad. The houses sat on half-acre lots. Most had American flags on the front porch. A few had POWMA flags too. Several had the Marine Corps Eagle, Globe, and anchor plaques beside the door, the kind families hang not for decoration, but because that symbol means something real to the people inside. Willowbrook Estates was military country, not exclusively but unmistakably. People said hello, people waved, people brought casseroles when someone on the block had surgery or when a deployment notice arrived. That's the kind of neighborhood it was. 12 houses circled the Willowbrook cul-de-sac, 11 of them for a long time existed in the kind of easy harmony that Americans spend their whole lives searching for. The 12th house, 14 Willowbrook Court, sat at the far end of the loop, partially shaded by 2 old white oak trees. For 4 years, that house had belonged to a retired warrant officer named Dale Kowalski, who moved to Phoenix when his knees gave out and the Tennessee winters got to be too much. Good man, good neighbor. He painted his mailbox every spring and kept a concrete birdbath near the front walk that the neighborhood kids treated like a landmark. In August of 2019, the Kowalski house sold, and then Renata Holloway moved in. But first, let me tell you about Thomas Briggs. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Eugene Briggs, United States Marine Corps, retired. Born September 14, 1963 in Cookeville, Tennessee, enlisted at 18, served 27 years with combat deployments to the Persian Gulf during Desert Storm in 1991, to Somalia in 1993, and to Al-Anbar province in Iraq in 2004. He earned the Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal with a Combat V, the Combat Action Ribbon twice, and a handful of other decorations he kept in a cigar box in his bedroom closet, not on the wall, because that's the kind of man he was. He retired in 2010 as a gunnery sergeant, E7, 4th Marine Division. He was 55 years old in the summer of 2019. Widower, his wife Carol had died of ovarian cancer in 2014. They'd had no children, just each other and a string of rescued dogs over the years. The last was Ginger, an aging golden retriever mix who'd come to him from the Montgomery County animal shelter at age 2 back when Carol was still alive. Ginger had slept on Carol's side of the bed every night since. Tom Briggs was not a big man physically, 5'10", maybe 170. After Thanksgiving dinner, but there was something about the way he stood, the way he was still in a room, that made people pay attention without knowing why. He kept a garden in his backyard, tomatoes and peppers in raised beds, and along the fence line Carol's rose bushes, 7 of them all planted together, varying shades of pink and white, and one deep red that bloomed like something from a painting every June. He tended them the way a man tends something that holds grief, carefully, quietly, every single day. On weekday mornings, Tom Briggs woke at 5:15, made coffee in a percolator he'd owned since 1998, and sat on his front porch with Ginger at his feet and a Worn leather journal open on his knee, he wrote in it everyday dates. Observations, whether whatever crossed his mind, Carol had given him that habit he never stopped. The kids on the block called him Mr. Tom. When Ella Patterson's bicycle got a flat 2 summers earlier, Tom had patched it without being asked and without making a big deal of it. When the Abrams family's basement flooded in a spring storm, Tom was the first one there with a wet dry vac and a case of cold water. He was the kind of quiet that people trust. He did have one wound that never fully healed, and I don't mean the shrapnel scar along his left forearm, though that was there too, in 2004 in Fallujah. Tom had been the ranking NCO on a convoy that was ambushed. He'd made decisions that day that saved 9 men, and one decision that couldn't save a 10th. Lance Corporal Danny Ruiz, 21 years old, from El Paso, Texas. Tom kept a photo of Danny on his refrigerator, just the two of them at some forward operating base laughing at something off camera he never talked about it, but Ginger always knew when the dream came. She'd put her gray muzzle on the edge of the mattress and stay there until Tom's breathing steadied. That was Ginger, that was Tom. On the first Saturday of August 2019, a pearl-white 2020 Cadillac Escalade pulled into the driveway of 14 Willowbrook Court at 9:47 in the morning, towing a rented U-Haul trailer that was not quite big enough for everything inside it. Tom Briggs watched from his porch over the top of his coffee mug. The woman who stepped out of the Escalade was 44 years old, wore oversized sunglasses and a linen blazer despite the August heat, and spent the first 40 minutes on her phone while 2 hired movers unloaded her belongings. She did not introduce herself to any neighbor. She did not wave. When old Roy Stimpel from 3 houses down walked over to say hello, Roy was 72, Army Signal Corps, Vietnam era, couldn't help being neighborly. She looked at him for a moment like he was a stranger asking for directions, said, "I'm busy," and went back to her call. Roy walked home, didn't say a word about it to anyone, just fed his cat and sat down. Her name was Renata Holloway, and by the end of the year, nearly everyone on Willowbrook Court would know that name in a way nobody wanted to. Here's what we knew about Renata in August of 2019. She had recently relocated from Nashville, where she'd spent 6 years as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical software company before a severance package, the nature of which was never fully clarified, publicly ended that chapter. She had 2 grown kids who didn't visit, an ex-husband who'd remarried within the year, and an Instagram account at Renata Lives Well with about 2,000 followers where she posted pictures of her interior decorating and captioned them things like "finally in my forever home" and "peace was always mine to claim." She drove a high-end car, she had expensive furniture, and she had no patience whatsoever for the fact that the neighborhood she'd moved into had noise. Dogs barked, kids played, lawn equipment ran on Saturday mornings. Tom Briggs had a rooster weather vane on his garage that rattled in the wind. None of these things were unusual in a suburban Tennessee cul-de-sac. None of them were acceptable to Renata Holloway. The first red flag came 10 days after she moved in. Tom was doing his morning walk with Ginger, same route he'd walked every day for 4 years, a slow half-loop around the cul-de-sac. Ginger was on leash as always. They passed the end of Renata's driveway. Ginger sniffed at the mailbox post, which was on public access right-of-way. Tom kept walking from the front door. "Can you keep that animal away from my property?" Tom stopped, turned, smiled even in that careful way of his. "Good morning." "She's on leash, we're on the easement." "I don't care, I don't want dog hair on my mailbox." Tom looked at the mailbox, looked at Ginger, looked back at Renata. "Nice morning," he said, and kept walking. Ginger's tail wagged the whole way home. That should have been the end of it. It was not. By September, the HOA had received its first complaint from 14 Willowbrook Court. Renata had filed a formal grievance claiming that Tom Briggs's rose garden was an unmanaged overgrowth in violation of Section 4.2 of the HOA Covenant, which governed landscaping within 3 feet of the shared property line. Tom measured the roses. The nearest bush was 4 feet and 2 inches from the property line, not in violation by any standard. He wrote that measurement in his leather journal with the date, September 11, 2019. He then went to Renata's door, knocked politely at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning to have a neighborly conversation about it. He brought 2 ears of corn from his garden, a small gesture, something Carol used to say you should always do, bring something when you knock. Renata opened the door and stared at the corn like he'd brought a live snake. I got the HOA letter, Tom said. Just wanted to let you know I measured. This morning, the roses are within compliance, but if there's something bothering you, we can talk through it. Renata looked him up and down. Then, listen, I have lived in 6 different communities across this state, and I have never had to deal with neighbors who think that just because they planted something 20 years ago, it gives them the right to run the whole street. This isn't your little base anymore. Tom held those ears of corn for a moment. Set them down on her front step, very gently. You have a good day, ma'am, he said. And he walked home. He didn't tell anyone, didn't post about it, didn't call the HOA back, just sat down on his porch and wrote the date and what had been said in his journal, word for word, because that's what you do when you've spent 27 years in an institution that taught you documentation saves lives. Direct hit engagement hook. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to be genuinely, sincerely reasonable with someone who had zero interest in being reasonable, someone who saw a handshake as a weakness to exploit? Drop a comment and tell me what happened, because I think a lot of you know exactly what Tom Briggs was up against. October brought cooler weather to Willowbrook Court. The white oaks in front of number 14 turned amber and gold. The mornings smelled like wood smoke and damp leaves. And the situation with Renata Holloway got steadily, methodically worse. It started with the trash. On the morning of October 4th, Tom found a black garbage bag split open at the seam against his fence line on the Holloway side. Rotting food waste, coffee grounds, what looked like the remains of a frozen lasagna. It had not blown there. The trajectory was wrong. The bag had been placed there or thrown. Tom photographed it with his phone, wrote the time and dates, bagged it up and disposed of it without a word. October 9th, Renata's silver 2018 BMW X5, her second vehicle, parked 18 inches over Tom's driveway easement, blocking the angle needed to pull his F-250 out without a 12-point turn. This happened on a Tuesday morning when Tom needed to be at his VA appointment in Clarksville by 8. He was 15 minutes late. He did not leave a note. He photographed the vehicle, license plate clearly visible, LQR 7843, Tennessee, and wrote it in the journal. October 17th, a formal notice from the HOA arrived, a new complaint from Renata. This time, Tom's rooster weather vane was a noise disturbance. The HOA board, which was run by a retired schoolteacher named Georgia Falk who had known Tom Briggs for 4 years, dismissed the complaint within 48 hours. Tom received a courtesy copy of the dismissal letter, which he filed in a manila folder he labeled simply Holloway. The folder was getting thicker. November brought the worst one yet. On the evening of November 3rd, a gray Sunday, 51 degrees, rain coming in sideways off the Cumberland, Roy Stempel's 15-year-old beagle, Herschel, somehow got into Renata's yard through a loose slat in the fence. Herschel was half-blind and arthritic. He wasn't being aggressive, he was just being 15. Renata called animal control. Not to get the dog home safely, to report it as a dangerous and aggressive animal threatening a resident. She used those exact words in the report, which Tom later obtained through a public records request. Animal control came, assessed Herschel, a 15-year-old beagle who could barely climb stairs, and noted in their report that the dog displayed no aggressive behavior whatsoever. Roy got Herschel back the same afternoon, but Roy was 82 now in his heart if not on paper, and the stress of it kept him up for 2 nights. Tom sat with him on the porch that evening. They drank instant coffee and didn't say much. Tom just stayed until Roy was settled. He wrote it all in the journal, filed the animal control report number, took note of who Renata had spoken to and what she'd said. He was building something, quietly, methodically. The way you build anything that has to hold weight. Direct hit engagement hook. Now I want you to notice something. Tom Briggs hasn't raised his voice once, he hasn't retaliated, he hasn't even complained to anyone except the pages of that old journal. Some of you are probably frustrated on his behalf right now, but here's what I want you to think about. What kind of man documents everything that carefully, that patiently? What does he know that Renata Holloway doesn't? Stay with me because we're getting there. December 2, 2019. A Monday morning, the first hard freeze of the season, the thermometer outside Tom's kitchen window read 28 degrees, and the grass was stiff and silver with frost. Tom had taken Ginger out for her morning constitutional at 6:30, leashed, same as always, and come back inside. He fed her, made his coffee, sat down with the journal. By 7:15, Ginger was in her bed by the back door napping. At 8 o'clock, Tom went to the garage to work on a chair he was restoring for Roy's. He had the radio on low, NPR. He worked until about 9:45 and then came back inside to refill his coffee. Ginger wasn't in her bed. The back door was ajar. He hadn't latched it properly, a mistake he'd never made before and would never make again. He called her. Nothing. He went outside, crossed the yard in his flannel shirt and boots, and found her on the far side of the rose garden, near the fence line on the Holloway side. She was on her side in the frozen grass, breathing but wrong. Her legs were paddling weakly, like she was trying to swim somewhere she couldn't reach. He knelt down beside her, put his hand on her ribs, felt her heart beat fast. Uneven, not right. There was a scattering of pale green granules in the grass around her. Small, uniform, like coarse salt, but colored wrong. Tom Briggs had been in combat in 3 different decades. He had seen things that don't belong in a narration like this, but the sight of his 11-year-old dog dying in the frozen grass, with whatever that stuff was still lying there beside her, he said later that it was one of the 5 worst moments of his life. He did not panic. He took 3 photographs of the granules before he touched her, collected a sample in a Ziploc bag he kept in his jacket pocket. This matters, remember it. And then he picked her up, got to his truck, and drove 40 miles to the emergency animal hospital in Clarksville. The diagnosis was antifreeze poisoning, ethylene glycol. The attending veterinarian, Dr. Pamela Osai, noted that the substance had almost certainly been consumed within the previous 3 to 4 hours. She noted that the granules Tom brought in were consistent with a crystallized antifreeze product, sometimes marketed as a driveway deicer. She noted in the clinical language of her report that the amount present was significantly more than would accumulate from incidental contact, and that the distribution patterns suggested deliberate placement. Ginger was in critical condition. The next 24 hours would determine whether she survived. Tom drove home in silence. He pulled into his driveway. He sat in the truck for a moment. He looked at the Holloway house, her Escalade in the driveway, lights on in the kitchen. And then he went inside. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened the journal, wrote the date, the time, and exactly what had happened, every detail, in the careful block handwriting of a man who understood that words on paper could outlast any argument. He made 2 phone calls that evening. The first was to Dr. Osai to check on Ginger. The second was to a man named Colonel Marcus Webb, USMC, retired, his oldest Friend in the world, a man he'd served with from 1987 to 2004. A man who, in 2019, happened to be a senior investigator with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he just told Marcus what happened calmly and completely, and Marcus listened, and at the end Marcus said, "Send me everything." Tom said, "I already know what I'm going to need." And he hung up the phone. Direct hit engagement hook. If you think Tom Briggs is going to let this go, you have never met a man like Tom Briggs, but here's what I want you to notice. He still didn't go next door, he still didn't post anything, he still didn't make a scene, because Tom Briggs had spent 27 years learning something that most people never do: the difference between reaction and response. Reactions are fast, responses are effective. What would you have done in his position? Tell me in the comments. Here's what nobody on Willowbrook Court knew at the time. Here's what Renata Holloway certainly didn't know. Tom Briggs, in addition to being a retired gunnery sergeant, had spent the last 6 years of his active service assigned to the Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division, NCIS Support Element, Camp Lejeune and Camp Pendleton. He knew exactly how investigations worked. He knew what constituted evidence. He knew chain of custody. He knew the difference between circumstantial and actionable. And that Ziploc bag of pale green granules, he had already taken it to a veterinary toxicologist at Vanderbilt University, a friend of Dr. Osai's, who confirmed within 48 hours that the substance was ethylene glycol in a crystallized form consistent with a commercially available product. Brand name: Crystal Clear De-Ice Driveway Granules. Now, here's what Colonel Marcus Webb found out within 72 hours of that phone call. First, Tom's property cameras, 2 of which he'd installed in 2018 after a package theft incident that had nothing to do with Renata, covered a combined field of view that included approximately 40% of the fence line between his property and number 14. Second, the camera on the south corner of Tom's garage had captured footage at approximately 7:43 a.m. on December 2nd. In that footage, at the edge of its field of view, a figure in a dark parka could be seen approaching the fence line from the Holloway side and appearing to scatter something along the ground. Near the rose garden, the figure was not fully identifiable from the angle, but the parka was. It was distinctive, deep burgundy with white trim on the hood. Anyone who'd seen Renata Holloway on her morning walks that November would have recognized it immediately. 3 neighbors confirmed, independently and without being asked leading questions, that they had seen Renata in that coat. Third, and this is where it gets significant, Colonel Webb's inquiry revealed that Renata Holloway had, 6 months earlier in Nashville, been the subject of an unresolved civil dispute with her previous neighbors over property damage. That dispute had been quietly settled out of court. The neighbors, a young couple named the Delgados, had accused Renata of cutting their internet cable and pouring concrete sealant into their drainage pipe. No criminal charges had been filed, but the record existed. And then there was this: Crystal Clear De-Ice Driveway Granules. Tom had never bought it, never used it. His driveway was stamped concrete. He used sand in winter, not chemical de-icer. His neighbors confirmed the same. A search of Renata Holloway's recent purchase history, obtained through a warrant Marcus helped facilitate, showed a purchase of Crystal Clear De-Ice, 2 5-pound bags from a hardware store in Clarksville, November 28, 2019, 4 days before Ginger was poisoned. 4 days. By the time Tom Briggs understood the full picture, sitting at his kitchen table on the evening of December 6th, Ginger resting on a blanket beside him, because she had survived barely through 4 days of IV treatment and the stubborn refusal of an old dog to give up, he had the following: veterinary documentation, toxicology confirmation, camera footage, purchase Records, witness statements, a prior incident pattern from Nashville, and a manila folder that now contained 4 months of dated, time-stamped, cross-reference documentation. He spread it all out on the kitchen table, took a photograph of the spread. Wrote in the journal, December 6, 2019, everything in order. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Webb. The second was to a Clarksville criminal defense attorney named James Earl Stafford, who had been Tom's fraternal brother in the Marine Veterans Legal Alliance for 11 years and who, in his civilian practice, specialized in both criminal prosecution consulting and civil litigation. The third was to the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office. December 9, 2019, a gray Monday morning, 34 degrees, thin clouds. No wind, the kind of morning where sound carries far and clean. Tom Briggs was on his front porch at 7:30 a.m. as he always was, coffee in a heavy ceramic mug, the one with the Marine Corps globe and anchor that Carol had given him on his retirement day. Ginger was inside on her blanket. She was still weak but eating again, still home. The journal was open on his knee, but he wasn't writing. He was watching the street. At 8:04 a.m., 2 Montgomery County Sheriff's cruisers turned onto Willowbrook Court, behind them a dark gray Ford Expedition from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, behind that a vehicle Tom recognized, James Earl Stafford's black Lincoln, carrying the civil process server. They pulled up in front of 14 Willowbrook Court, no sirens, no theater. Just tires on cold asphalt and doors opening with deliberate precision. Renata Holloway came to her front door at 8:09. She was in a bathrobe, cream colored, expensive, and she had a mug of her own, and she looked at the 4 vehicles in front of her house with the expression of someone who is certain there has been a mistake. There was no mistake. Deputy First Class Karen Whitfield served the criminal summons first, 1 count of aggravated cruelty to an animal under Tennessee Code annotated section 3914-12. A Class E felony, 1 count of criminal trespass. The TBI investigator, a calm, unhurried man named Special Agent Dennis Cho, served the accompanying search warrant for the residence and vehicle. The civil process server handed Renata Holloway a 47-page civil complaint filed in Montgomery County Circuit Court, intentional infliction of emotional distress, destruction of property. Ginger's medical bills had reached $14,200 and climbing, harassment and tortious interference with the quiet enjoyment of property. The combined civil demand, $312,000, plus legal fees. Renata said something, it wasn't clear enough to hear from across the street. But later she claimed it was, I need to call my lawyer. Her lawyer was a Nashville civil attorney who, upon reviewing the documentation package James Earl Stafford's office transmitted that same morning, reportedly said, and I'm paraphrasing here because the direct quote involves language that's not appropriate for this format, words to the effect of, there is very little I can do for you on the criminal side. Renata's Escalade was searched, the second bag of crystal clear de-ice. Driveway granules, approximately 4 pounds remaining, was found in the storage compartment beneath the cargo floor. It was photographed, bagged, and logged. From his front porch, Tom Briggs watched. He didn't walk over, didn't say a word, just held his coffee mug in both hands and watched the process unfold the way it was supposed to. Roy Stempel came out of his house at 8:22, stood on his own porch, saw what was happening, and nodded once in Tom's direction. Tom nodded back. A few other neighbors filtered out onto their porches over the following 20 minutes. Nobody said anything, nobody needed to. After the sheriff's vehicles left, and after the TBI expedition pulled away, and after the process server had gone, after all of that, Willowbrook Court went very, very quiet. Renata Holloway did not come outside for the rest of the day. The neighborhood did not erupt in celebration. There were no fireworks, no Cheering, just the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday in December, a leaf blower. 2 streets over, someone's weather vane turning, a dog barking in the distance. Tom went inside, fed Ginger her midday medicine, made a sandwich, read for an hour, wrote in the journal. The weeks that followed were less quiet in the legal sense, but the street itself was subdued. People knew, the kind of information that travels on a cul-de-sac cannot be stopped, but it moves in low voices, in nods and glances. Not in shouts. Georgia Falk, the HOA board chair, sent Tom a card, just a plain card with 3 handwritten lines. We're glad Ginger is okay. Glad you handled it the way you did. The board voted unanimously to dismiss all Holloway filed complaints from the record. Renata Holloway did not interact with any neighbor after December 9th. By the middle of January 2020, there was a for sale sign in front of 14 Willowbrook Court, a Cardinal Realty sign, burgundy and gold, swinging slightly in the winter wind. Nobody on the street was surprised, nobody was sorry. In late January, a U-Haul appeared, a smaller one this time. It was loaded by a single moving company worker and Renata herself, who wore dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky and did not speak to anyone. Nobody came out to say goodbye, nobody waved. Dale Kowalski's old concrete birdbath was still in the front yard. She was leaving it behind. The U-Haul pulled out of the cul-de-sac at 11:33 a.m. on a Thursday. Roy Stempel watched from his living room window. He didn't say a thing. He just went back to his chair, picked up his book, and scratched Herschel behind the ears. You see, folks, this is where the story doesn't end, it settles. Ginger recovered fully by late January. She had lost 3 pounds and some of her swagger, but her appetite came back and her tail wagged, and by February, she was back on her morning walk with Tom, same route, same time, and she sniffed the old mailbox post at number 14, now vacant, and kept right on going. The criminal case against Renata Holloway proceeded through Montgomery County Circuit Court in September of 2020. Following a plea agreement, she was convicted of 1 count of aggravated animal cruelty, a Class E felony in Tennessee. She was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, a permanent ban on owning or residing with animals, and ordered to pay restitution of $14,200 for Ginger's medical bills. The civil case settled in October 2020. The terms were not fully disclosed, because they rarely are, but sources familiar with the settlement indicated that the figure exceeded $220,000, inclusive of Tom's legal fees, which James Earl Stafford had largely deferred pending resolution. Renata Holloway's Instagram account, @RenataLivesWell, went private in December 2019. It was deleted entirely in the spring of 2020. By all accounts, she relocated to a rental apartment in Memphis. Her LinkedIn profile, last visible in 2021, listed her as in transition. Her ex-husband declined comment when a local Clarksville news blog covered the story in early 2021. Her grown children were not reachable for comment. The Nashville neighbors, the Delgados, filed a separate civil action when the Tennessee case became public record. That case was settled privately in the summer of 2021. As for 14 Willowbrook Court, Dale Kowalski's old house, it sold in the spring of 2020 to a young couple from Fort Campbell. He was a staff sergeant in the 101st Airborne, currently stationed stateside. She was a physical therapist at Blanchfield Army Community Hospital. They had a 3-year-old golden retriever named Biscuit and a baby on the way. Tom brought them 2 ears of corn from his garden. They invited him for dinner. He went. By the following June, in the summer of 2021, Ginger had adopted Biscuit as her project, tolerating his nonsense with the patient majesty of an old queen. Receiving a clumsy duke, the baby, born in October 2020, was named Eliza. She had learned by summer that the old man next door had a soft chair on his porch and would let you sit in it. And Carol's roses, the 7 along the fence line, the ones Renata had tried to have declared violations, bloomed that June in pink and white and deep. Deep red, bigger than the year before, taller, as if they had something to prove. Tom cut 3 stems of the red ones and put them in a glass vase on the kitchen table. He wrote in the journal, June 14, 2021, the roses came back. There's something I want you to sit with as we close out this story. Tom Briggs spent 4 months absorbing escalating harassment from a woman who mistook his silence for weakness, his patience for surrender. She looked at retired Marine and saw someone she could push around. She was wrong in a way that only becomes fully clear in hindsight when you understand what was building behind that quiet, behind that front porch coffee and that worn leather journal. Tom didn't fight back out of ego. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to protect Ginger, protect his neighbors, and honor Carol's roses and Roy Stempel's peace of mind and the ordinary, hard-won dignity of a neighborhood full of people who'd earned the right to live quietly. That's different from pride. That's different from vengeance. It's closer to duty. You see, folks, some men carry their wars in them the way other people carry music, quietly without display, and when those men finally move, they move with the precision of someone who has never had the luxury of imprecision. Renata Holloway thought she was dealing with an old man, a retiree, someone who could be outlasted. She was dealing with someone who had kept his nerve in Al Anbar province in 2004, someone who had counted seconds in the dark and made decisions under fire and carried the weight of other people's lives across 3 decades and never once made it someone else's problem. She brought ethylene glycol to a documentation fight. She lost everything. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. And never ever pick a fight with a Marine who has spent his whole life learning the difference between when to be loud and when to be silent, and who always knows which one the moment calls for. To Tom, wherever you are, and to Ginger, still chasing her dreams in that worn-out golden coat, thank you for reminding us what justice looks like when it's done right. And to everyone watching right now, if you've got a neighbor story of your own, the kind that tested you, the kind where you had to decide what kind of person you were going to be, tell us in the comments, because every one of those stories matters, every one. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and take care of your dogs. We'll see you next time. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.